My mom called me, ungrateful for moving out. Then she gave my old room to a stranger. The morning I moved out was the kind of overcast gray that makes everything feel a little heavier than it really is. The sky was swollen with clouds, threatening rain, but never quite delivering. I remember watching the wind disturb the maple trees lining our cracked driveway, while I loaded the last of my belongings into the back of my weathered sedan. My suitcase, stuffed until the seams bulged, sat in the trunk like a symbolic coffin for the version of myself I was about to leave behind. For a long time, I stood there with my fingers resting on the lid, unsure if I was about to bury the past or exhume something I'd kept hidden for far too long. Inside the house, it was uncomfortably quiet, too quiet for a place that had once echoed with the volatile energy of a family perpetually on the brink of combustion. The kind of household where silence wasn't peace but a countdown. My mother hadn't come out to help. She hadn't said goodbye. The night before, she had offered no hugs, no tears, no reminiscing about childhood milestones or birthday mornings spent in that same little room I'd grown up in. What she had offered, though, was a pointed statement, her voice stiff and sharp like the snap of a dead branch. "So, that's it? You're just going to leave?" I didn't answer then, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I knew nothing I said would register through the tinted glass of her pride and wounded ego. I had spent years trying to thread meaning into conversations that were more like interrogations, to justify my choices with careful syllables, and all it had earned me was more silence, more gaslighting, more being labeled as difficult or disrespectful. In this house, independence was treason, and gratitude was only recognized when it looked like obedience. Driving away that morning should have felt like liberation, like a chain had finally snapped loose and the weight of her voice had lifted from my spine. But instead, it was numbness that settled into my chest. Not joy, not relief, just a peculiar stillness, as if my soul was waiting to see if it was really safe to breathe. I didn't cry as I left, but I also didn't smile. Instead, I focused on the road, my knuckles white against the wheel, while the last 23 years of my life shrank in the rearview mirror like a distant nightmare. My new apartment wasn't much. It was tucked above a laundromat that never quite silenced its clanging, and the walls bore the fading ghosts of water damage that told their own stories in warped streaks. But it was mine. Every square inch of it echoed with the unfamiliar sensation of choice. I could hang whatever art I wanted without it being deemed weird or dark. I could cook pasta at midnight without triggering a rant about wasting gas or being lazy. And most of all, I could sit in silence without having to anticipate what version of my mother would come stomping down the hallway next. At first, she texted constantly. The first week, there were hourly check-ins, laced with passive-aggressive guilt masquerading as concern. "Hope you're eating. Your sister asked about you. Why don't you text her back?" Followed by, "Don't forget who was there for you all these years." Then the texts turned sharper. "I don't know who's filling your head with these ideas. You never used to be so cold." And eventually the nuclear strike. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? Running away like you're some victim? So ungrateful." Ungrateful. The word clung to my skin like grease. I'd been called worse, certainly. Selfish, dramatic, unstable, but somehow ungrateful hit deeper, because it wasn't just an insult, it was a verdict. It implied that everything I had endured, the emotional manipulation, the unpredictable moods, the suffocating control, had been justified by the roof over my head and the food in my stomach. Gratitude, in her lexicon, wasn't about appreciation. It was about silence. It was about swallowing my truth and regurgitating hers. For weeks after, I avoided driving past the old neighborhood. I didn't want to risk seeing that house. Didn't want the possibility of running into her at the grocery store and facing that thin smile she wore when she was on the edge of a performance. I dove into work, decorated my space with things that made me feel like I had a personality again, and started reconnecting with people I distanced myself from during the years I was too exhausted to maintain friendships. Then, 2 months after moving out, I got the text that cracked something wide open inside me. "Just wanted to let you know, I've rented out your old room. He's a nice guy, respectful. Pays on time. Thought you should hear it from me first." No greeting, no explanation, just that. At first, I read the message twice, thinking I'd misunderstood. My old room? The one with the constellation stickers still clinging to the ceiling? The one I'd painted myself with trembling hands the summer after high school, hoping that maybe if I made it look like someone lived there, I'd start to feel like I did too. She hadn't mentioned it when I left. Hadn't asked if I wanted to come pick up the box of journals I'd forgotten under the bed, or the stack of photos still tucked in the closet. She hadn't offered to store anything. Just cleared it out, handed it to a stranger, and then texted me like she was giving me a weather update. I remember standing in my kitchen, phone in hand, while the air turned thick and hot around me. There was no apology, no recognition of what that space meant, just clinical detachment, as if it had never belonged to anyone but her. Something ugly and primal rose up in me then. Not sadness, not even hurt. Just this incandescent rage, the kind that simmers beneath your skin when you realize the thing you were grieving was never yours to begin with. In a fit of impulse, I drove there. I don't even remember grabbing my keys or getting in the car. One moment I was in my apartment, and the next I was parked across the street, heart thudding like a war drum in my chest as I stared at the porch steps I'd tripped down 1,000 times growing up. The house looked the same, weather-worn, sagging in places, its paint faded and tired. But something was off. The curtain in my old room, my curtain, was gone, replaced with a plain gray panel that didn't belong. I could see the edge of a shelf through the sliver of glass, books stacked neatly. None of them mine. I don't know what I expected. Maybe I thought seeing it would give me closure. Maybe I thought I'd walk up to the door, confront her, and finally say all the things I never could when I lived under her roof. But I didn't get out. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. Because suddenly, the realization hit me in full. She hadn't just let me go. She'd replaced me. The guilt she'd weaponized after I left wasn't about losing a child. It was about losing control. And once she couldn't guilt me into coming back, she filled the space with someone else. Someone who paid rent. Someone who didn't ask for emotional accountability. Someone who wasn't too sensitive or too much. That room had been my last connection to that house. My last tether to a past I had tried to both escape and mourn. And now it belonged to someone who probably didn't even know my name. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was surgical, cold, calculated. That night, I sat on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by boxes I'd never fully unpacked, and opened the one labeled room stuff. Inside were old notebooks, faded ticket stubs, dried rose petals from a bouquet I'd gotten after a high school play, and a cracked snow globe I'd kept since I was 8. I picked up a Polaroid of me on the front porch, braces and bangs, holding a birthday cupcake. My mother was beside me, hand on my shoulder, smiling like we were the picture of maternal perfection. I stared at it for a long time before setting it on fire in the kitchen sink. Letting go wasn't a singular act. It wasn't a one-time decision, but 1,000 little choices made every day. And as the edges of that photograph curled into blackened paper ash, I made another one. I was done mourning someone who never really saw me. Done letting her live rent-free in my thoughts, even as she rented my room to a stranger. She had replaced me. Now it was my turn to replace the story she'd written about me with one of my own. I didn't plan to speak to her again. Not that week, not that month. The text about the stranger renting my room should have been the final nail in a coffin I'd already buried 6 feet deep beneath years of resentment and emotional bruises. But unresolved wounds have a way of festering in silence, fermenting in the dark corners of your mind until they swell into something grotesque. And like some sick alchemy, my silence didn't bring peace. It brought questions. Too many questions. The kind that echo through your chest like the aftershocks of an earthquake long after the tremors fade. Who was he? The man living in my room. What did he see when he walked in? Did he notice the faint pencil lines along the closet's wooden trim, where I'd once charted my growth in stealth as a child? Did he sleep under the same ceiling where I'd once stared at constellations made of glow-in-the-dark stickers, imagining myself somewhere else, anywhere else, while the sounds of my mother's anger boiled just beyond the door? Did he rearrange the furniture? Did he notice the little chip on the baseboard where I'd accidentally kicked it during one of those nights when I wanted to scream but didn't? Was he told who lived there before him? Or was I scrubbed clean from the walls like an inconvenient stain, just another name no longer spoken, a past she was eager to overwrite. I hadn't told anyone. Not about the text. Not about the stranger. Not about the way my hands trembled after I drove away from the house that evening. Shame is a funny parasite. It convinces you that even your pain is somehow a crime, that speaking about it makes you dramatic or delusional, or worse, vindictive. I carried that shame into the following week like a stone strapped to my back, smiling at coworkers, making small talk with neighbors, paying bills on time like I wasn't unraveling under the weight of an identity that had nowhere to live anymore. It wasn't until I met up with my friend Leah for coffee that the dam began to leak. Leah was one of the few people who had known me before the great disassociation began, before I mastered the art of smiling through clenched teeth and rationalizing every guilt trip my mother dressed in the costume of maternal concern. She had seen the way my mother's voice could turn silk into steel, how the softest words could hold the sharpest edges. We met at a small cafe tucked away from the main street, the kind of place that always smelled like cinnamon and steamed milk. Leah arrived late, as always, apologizing with a breathless hug and a latte bribe. We sat in a sunlit corner booth, and for the first few minutes we danced around the obvious, pretending we were normal people catching up on normal lives. Then she asked, "Have you talked to her since the move?" I wanted to lie, not to protect my mother, God no, but to avoid admitting how badly I still craved her approval even now, even after everything. But something about the way Leah looked at me, her eyes soft but direct, made it impossible to keep the mask on. "She rented out my room," I said, the words cracking in my throat like dry twigs. Leah blinked. "What?" I didn't look up. "Some guy. Just moved in." She texted me. "No warning. Nothing." Her silence was a gentle sort of rage. "And you're sure he's staying in your old room? Not just the guest?" "No," she said. "Your old room. Like it never meant anything. Like it wasn't full of me." The anger came slowly, like a tide inching its way up the shore. Leah's fingers curled around her cup, knuckles whitening. "That's not normal. That's not okay." "I know," I said, though part of me still wasn't convinced I had the right to feel this betrayed. But she made it seem like I was the one who abandoned her, that I'm ungrateful, selfish, and then, just like that, she fills the space with someone else. "Because she couldn't control you anymore," Leah said, and control was the only love she ever learned how to give. It hit me then, the truth of it, the cruelty of it. My mother's affection had always come with strings, with contracts hidden in fine print, and when I stopped signing them, she revoked the lease, on love, on belonging, on my identity. That night, I went home and stared at my ceiling for hours. The fan spun above me, its blades whispering lullabies to a room that had become a sanctuary, but it didn't feel like safety. Not really, because safety still required vigilance. I was still watching for texts, still anticipating calls, still rehearsing conversations I'd never have, writing imaginary letters I'd never send. And I realized then, distance hadn't given me freedom. It had only shifted the battlefield. I needed to see the room. Not from the car, not from across the street. I needed to stand inside it, to look the betrayal in the eye and ask it what it wanted from me. So I called my sister. Emily was younger by 4 years, but in many ways she'd aged faster. She learned early how to blend in, how to keep her head down and absorb the emotional shrapnel flying through the house without complaint. She was the golden child, not because she was favored, but because she learned how to be invisible in all the right ways. We hadn't spoken much since I left, not because we were angry at each other, but because silence was our native language. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, hey." A pause. "You okay?" she asked. "Not really." Another pause. Longer. Deeper. "You want to come by?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Yeah." She gave me a time when Mom wouldn't be home. I didn't ask how she knew. She always knew. When I arrived, the door was unlocked. The house smelled different. Cleaner, but less alive. Like someone had Febrezed over a murder scene. Emily was in the kitchen, folding towels with military precision, her eyes darting toward me, but never quite landing. I said her name, and she smiled. But it was the kind of smile you wear at a funeral when you don't know what else to do. We didn't speak as she led me to the room. It wasn't mine anymore. The walls were repainted a sterile eggshell. My posters were gone. The desk had been replaced with a small writing table. There was a twin bed with a plaid comforter and a laptop charging on the nightstand. The window was cracked open. A breeze stirred the curtains, his curtains. There was a half-empty mug on the table, something herbal and expensive smelling. I stood in the doorway for a long time, afraid that if I crossed the threshold I would vanish entirely. Emily said nothing. I stepped inside. Everything was wrong. Even the light was different. Warmer. More forgiving. The shadows that had once haunted the corners were gone, replaced by tasteful organization. There were books on the shelf, none of which I recognized. No fingerprints of my existence remained. My room wasn't just gone. It had been erased. "She cleared it out the day after you moved," Emily said behind me. Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact. Didn't even let me go through it. Said she needed the space. Said it was time to stop babying the past. I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. Babying the past? She lived in it. Not anymore. I turned to look at her. "Why didn't you tell me?" She shrugged. "What would it have changed? You already left." "I didn't leave you." "I know." And in that moment, I believed her. We sat on the porch after that, watching the sun slip behind the neighbor's roof. Emily smoked a cigarette she pretended she didn't smoke, and I let the silence stretch between us like an old frayed blanket we were too tired to mend. "She misses you," she said finally. "No," I said. "She misses control." Emily didn't argue. When I left, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had seen what I came to see. The room was gone, but more importantly, the illusion was gone. And without the illusion, her power shrank into something small and manageable, a paper tiger, a shadow that couldn't follow me past the threshold of who I was becoming. Later that night, I wrote in my journal, a practice I'd abandoned years ago when I realized words were dangerous in a house where privacy was a myth. I wrote about the room, about the stranger, about my mother, about how every time I tried to breathe, I still half expected to be told I was doing it wrong. I wrote until the pages ached under the weight of ink and memory. And when I was done, I wrote one final sentence. "She can keep the room. I'm taking my self-worth." The days that followed my visit to the house were quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet that soothes the nerves like balm over raw skin. No, it was a stillness born of internal whiplash, the kind that sets in when you've peeled back the curtain and seen something you can't unsee. I found myself replaying the sterile neatness of what used to be my sanctuary, now occupied by someone who knew nothing of the grief that lived in those floorboards, the silent battles fought in the lonely twilight hours, or the whispered affirmations I'd murmured into my pillow just to make it through another day of being invisible inside my own life. The truth was undeniable. I had been replaced. Not in the cinematic, melodramatic way people sometimes exaggerate in stories of family estrangement, but in the most insidious and chillingly casual way possible, swiftly, with no warning, and without a hint of remorse. It wasn't simply that my mother had given the room to a stranger. It was the cavalier ease with which she did it, the way she discarded 24 years of my existence, the relics of a childhood that had survived only because I had made myself small enough to avoid becoming the next casualty in her endless war with disappointment. I wanted to believe that maybe she needed the money, that perhaps it was desperation, not callousness, that led her to this choice. But that fragile hope shattered when I saw the updates she posted on Facebook. Pictures of brunches, home redecorations, a new garden bench under the apricot tree that once served as a makeshift fortress in my childhood games. There was even a new coat of paint on the front door, a vivid coral pink that practically screamed rebirth. Everything about it radiated transformation, and none of it had anything to do with me. It was as if my absence was the necessary erasure she needed to finally live her ideal version of motherhood, one free from contradiction, criticism, or complication. I started sleeping with the bedroom door closed, even though I lived alone. There was a phantom sensation of being watched, judged, as if the walls still carried her gaze. I'd look around my apartment, tiny, cluttered, full of imperfect furniture from Craigslist and memories I was only just beginning to make, and ask myself why it still didn't feel like home. Was it because home, no matter how broken, was still the first place we learned to navigate the world? Or was it that I still hadn't forgiven myself for choosing distance over duty? She cleared it out the day after you moved, Emily said behind me. Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact. Didn't even let me go through it. Said she needed the space. Said it was time to stop babying the past. I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. Babying the past? She lived in it. Not anymore. I turned to look at her. Why didn't you tell me? She shrugged. What would it have changed? You already left. I didn't leave you. I know. And in that moment, I believed her. We sat on the porch after that, watching the sun slip behind the neighbor's roof. Emily smoked a cigarette she pretended she didn't smoke, and I let the silence stretch between us like an old, frayed blanket we were too tired to mend. She misses you, she said finally. No, I said. She misses control. Emily didn't argue. When I left, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had seen what I came to see. The room was gone, but more importantly, the illusion was gone. And without the illusion, her power shrank into something small and manageable, a paper tiger, a shadow that couldn't follow me past the threshold of who I was becoming. Later that night, I wrote in my journal, a practice I'd abandoned years ago when I realized words were dangerous in a house where privacy was a myth. I wrote about the room, about the stranger, about my mother, about how every time I tried to breathe, I still half expected to be told I was doing it wrong. I wrote until the pages ached under the weight of ink and memory, and when I was done, I wrote one final sentence. She can keep the room. I'm taking my self-worth. The days that followed my visit to the house were quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet that soothes the nerves like balm over raw skin. No. It was a stillness born of internal whiplash, the kind that sets in when you've peeled back the curtain and seen something you can't unsee. I found myself replaying the sterile neatness of what used to be my sanctuary, now occupied by someone who knew nothing of the grief that lived in those floorboards, the silent battles fought in the lonely twilight hours, or the whispered affirmations I'd murmured into my pillow just to make it through another day of being invisible inside my own life. The truth was undeniable. I had been replaced. Not in the cinematic, melodramatic way people sometimes exaggerate in stories of family estrangement, but in the most insidious and chillingly casual way possible, swiftly, with no warning, and without a hint of remorse. It wasn't simply that my mother had given the room to a stranger. It was the cavalier ease with which she did it. The way she discarded 24 years of my existence, the relics of a childhood that had survived only because I had made myself small enough to avoid becoming the next casualty in her endless war with disappointment. I wanted to believe that maybe she needed the money, that perhaps it was desperation, not callousness, that led her to this choice. But that fragile hope shattered when I saw the updates she posted on Facebook. Pictures of brunches, home redecorations, a new garden bench under the apricot tree that once served as a makeshift fortress in my childhood games. There was even a new coat of paint on the front door, a vivid coral pink that practically screamed rebirth. Everything about it radiated transformation, and none of it had anything to do with me. It was as if my absence was the necessary erasure she needed to finally live her ideal version of motherhood, one free from contradiction, criticism, or complication. I started sleeping with the bedroom door closed, even though I lived alone. There was a phantom sensation of being watched, judged, as if the walls still carried her gaze. I'd look around my apartment, tiny, cluttered, full of imperfect furniture from Craigslist and memories I was only just beginning to make, and ask myself why it still didn't feel like home. Was it because home, no matter how broken, was still the first place we learned to navigate the world? Or was it that I still hadn't forgiven myself for choosing distance over duty? My phone remained silent for nearly a week after that last visit. Emily, ever the emotional shapeshifter, sent a handful of vague, coded texts that said a lot by saying almost nothing. She asked if you were okay. I didn't answer. The guy in the room keeps to himself, doesn't ask questions. She's been calmer lately. What was I supposed to do with that? Applaud the tranquility that came at the cost of my emotional eviction? Celebrate the newfound domestic balance achieved through a meticulous act of erasure? Every word she sent landed in my chest like an accusation, like I was the volatile ingredient who'd made our home so difficult in the first place. But then came the text that made everything boil over. She wants to come by your place, says she has something to return. Return? I stared at the message for a long time, my mind looping through possibilities. I hadn't left anything behind. Not intentionally. Everything that mattered to me I'd taken with me, or so I'd thought. I didn't respond. 2 days later, I heard the knock. I didn't need to check the peephole to know it was her. Mothers have a rhythm, even in their knocking, precise, expectant, loaded. She stood there, arms crossed, face unreadable behind large sunglasses that made her look more like a soap opera villain than the woman who once braided my hair while humming along to Norah Jones. In her left hand, a worn cardboard box, light brown, taped once down the center. Familiar. I opened the door only halfway. She didn't wait for an invitation. "I figured you wouldn't answer your phone," she said, pushing past me and setting the box down on the edge of my kitchen island. "So I came." I watched her, carefully, like one might observe a snake in the grass, unsure if it was venomous or merely decorative. "What is that?" I asked, nodding toward the box. She adjusted her sunglasses but didn't remove them. "Just some things I found from your closet. Thought you might want them." I stared at it. Didn't move. She looked around my apartment, the corners of her mouth twitching with disapproval. "It's cozy." There it was, the backhanded insult, masquerading as an observation. She couldn't help herself. "It's mine," I said simply. "Well, of course it is," she replied, as though we were discussing the weather and not the shattered framework of our relationship. She didn't sit. She didn't ask if I was well. She didn't offer an apology or even a half-hearted gesture at reconciliation. Instead, she moved as if she were surveying a rental property she had once owned but no longer saw value in. "I didn't mean to upset you," she said at last, her tone so flat it could have been pre-recorded. "Renting out the room, I mean. It just made sense." Made sense. She made it sound like math. I opened the box. Inside were fragments of a life I no longer recognized. A worn-out journal with pages curled from years of humidity. A friendship bracelet from middle school, its threads faded to near invisibility. A photograph of me at 7 years old, sitting in the backyard beneath the apricot tree, face smeared with watermelon, eyes lit up like bonfires. I didn't remember the photo being taken. She watched me, waiting for something. Maybe tears, maybe thanks, maybe an invitation to pretend this was normal. "You called me ungrateful," I said softly. She stiffened. "You said I was abandoning you, that I was choosing strangers over family. And then you gave my room to someone you met on Craigslist. And now you're here, bringing me a box of what? Sentimental debris?" She frowned. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" She pulled off her sunglasses, revealing eyes that looked tired but not sorry. "I didn't know how to deal with you," she said after a long silence. "You were always so dramatic." There it was, the summation of my entire personhood in a word designed to invalidate every plea I'd ever made. "Dramatic," I repeated. "Yes. You made everything heavier than it needed to be. You were always questioning things, always needing more than I knew how to give." That wasn't drama. That was survival. She blinked, slowly, and for a fleeting moment I thought I saw something shift in her, a crack, a flicker of something resembling awareness, but it vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by years of stubbornness and unspoken grief. "I thought maybe we could start fresh," she said. I laughed. Sharp, cold, unplanned. "You already started fresh. You did it the day you boxed up my life and rented out my room." Her mouth opened, then closed again. She looked smaller now, not vulnerable, just reduced. Like the illusion of authority she'd always cloaked herself in had started to unravel in the dim light of my unpolished kitchen. She didn't stay much longer after that. When she left, she didn't say goodbye, and I didn't watch her go. Instead, I sat with the box, pulling each item out like an archaeologist excavating a tomb. The artifacts weren't magical. They didn't bring closure or joy or even much sadness. They were just remnants, echoes. And in a strange way, that comforted me, because they were proof that I had existed there once, fully, loudly. Even if my mother had rewritten the narrative, the evidence hadn't been completely destroyed. Later that night, I lit a candle and burned one of the photos, an old one of my mother and me, smiling at some family event, my face young and hopeful, hers flawless and unreadable. The flames curled around the edges until the image disappeared into ash. It wasn't revenge. It was release. And I slept without dreaming of that house. Closure isn't always a grand gesture. It doesn't arrive with trumpets or dramatic speeches, nor does it come with apology letters wrapped in lavender-scented envelopes. Sometimes, closure is just a moment, silent, stark, and profoundly private, when you realize you no longer crave the approval of someone who never truly saw you. It's the first breath you take without checking who's watching. It's waking up one morning and not reaching for your phone to see if they've texted. It's freedom. Not because someone set you free, but because you chose to walk out of the cage and leave the door swinging behind you. 3 months passed after my mother left my apartment with that torn-up box and the hollow excuse of starting fresh. I didn't call her. I didn't go home. The stranger she'd rented my old room to, his name was Calvin, apparently, became a ghost story my sister told in small, uncomfortable snippets. He was quiet. He paid on time. He wasn't family, but he didn't challenge her like I did. According to Emily, that was enough for my mother. Stability over connection. Agreement over honesty. Surface-level peace over authentic chaos. Emily, for her part, had become the accidental messenger between us, caught in the no-man's land between obligation and empathy. She wasn't cruel like Mom, nor was she passive like Dad had always been. She was Switzerland with a bleeding heart, trying to mediate a war without weapons or a flag. I appreciated her efforts, but I didn't envy her position. Every call with her felt like a negotiation, like she was constantly trying to manage expectations, hers, mine, and Mom's, without breaking under the weight of 3 people's emotional debris. "She's not changing," Emily said one afternoon. Her voice crackled slightly over the phone, the result of her using those cheap Bluetooth earbuds she always forgot to charge. "I never thought she would," I replied, sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. "Change isn't really her thing." "She says you're punishing her." I laughed, not bitterly, just tired. "I'm not punishing her. I'm just done pretending I wasn't punished first." There was silence on the other end, the kind that fills the spaces between broken people when they realize some wounds aren't meant to be explained, only accepted. The wedding invitation arrived in April. Not mine, Emily's. She had finally decided to marry her longtime partner, Jordan, a soft-spoken teacher with kind eyes and a quiet, unshakable belief that people could grow if given the right soil. He adored her, worshipped her really, and while Emily had always been afraid of commitment, something about Jordan made her brave enough to leap. I was genuinely happy for her. Still, when I saw the return address printed in bold at the top corner of the envelope, Hartman Residence, something inside me coiled tight. The invitation was elegant, minimal, and painfully traditional. Gold lettering, formal tone. "The Hartman family invites you," it began, like we were all still connected by more than just blood and memory. My name was written in the same font as my mother's, as if we'd agreed to play house again for one day. There was even a note at the bottom. "Your room will be ready if you'd like to stay for the weekend." I stared at that sentence for a long time, my fingers tracing the raised print. It was like an aftershock, small, yet jarring. Your room, my room, the one she emptied, the one Calvin had slept in, the one that had been mine, until it became convenient for it not to be. Was this her olive branch? A bed instead of an apology? A room instead of remorse? I set the invitation aside. I didn't RSVP right away. I didn't know if I wanted to go, but the truth was, I knew I would. Not for her, not even for closure. I would go for Emily. And for myself. The day of the wedding was unseasonably warm, like the weather was daring us all to pretend nothing had ever gone cold. I arrived at the venue, an old converted barn with whitewashed walls and fairy lights strung across the rafters, wearing a deep navy dress and a version of myself that was neither angry nor afraid. I'd spent the last year learning how to wear my independence like armor, not a wound. I had learned to be alone without being lonely, to exist without orbiting someone else's needs. My mother spotted me from across the room. Her face did a strange contortion, relief maybe or discomfort masked as pride. But she didn't come over immediately. Instead, she lingered near the hors d'oeuvres table, speaking too loudly about floral arrangements and pretending the weight of our silence hadn't dragged its long shadow behind her for months. Emily floated down the aisle 30 minutes later, radiant in a lace-sleeved gown that made her look like the protagonist of a fairy tale, written by someone who finally learned to love themselves. Her smile when she passed by me was everything I needed to remind me why I had come. The ceremony was short, heartfelt, and refreshingly honest. No grand promises, just two people choosing each other with eyes open. After the ceremony, during mocktail hour, my mother finally approached me. "You look well," she said. I nodded. "I am." She hesitated. "I'm glad you came." "I came for Emily." A pause, a flicker of something behind her eyes. "She's lucky to have you," she said finally. "She always has been." More silence. Then, with surprising softness, "I miss you." I wanted to say you miss the idea of me, the quiet me, the obedient me, the me who never asked why love came with so many strings. But I didn't. Instead I said, "I miss the version of you who made me feel safe." She didn't have a response. She turned away soon after that, called over by a neighbor with an overly dramatic fascinator and a question about seating arrangements. And just like that, the conversation was over. Not with a bang, but with a retreat. I didn't feel sad, or angry, or relieved. I felt done. Not in the way people sometimes say they're done when they want someone to chase them, but truly, deeply, irrevocably done. With the yearning, the hunger for her approval, the ache of wanting her to be someone she couldn't be. I no longer needed her to understand my pain. I just needed her to stop pretending it didn't exist. Later that night, I didn't stay in the old house. I booked a hotel instead, a modest little suite with clean sheets and a view of nothing special. It felt more like home than the room she'd emptied ever did. The next morning I packed up, checked out, and drove by the house one last time. It looked the same, that damn coral pink door still screaming its need for reinvention. I didn't go in. I didn't knock. I didn't even slow down. I just kept driving. Months passed. Seasons shifted. I got a promotion at work. I redecorated my apartment. I started seeing someone, a bookstore clerk with a sarcastic streak and a laugh that made even my worst days seem tolerable. I didn't tell my mother. She never asked. One day, Emily called. "She's thinking of selling the house," she said. "Too many rooms, not enough people." I didn't respond right away. "That makes sense," I said finally. "I think she's trying to move on," Emily added, hesitant. "I don't think she knows how." "I hope she figures it out," I replied. "I really do." And I meant it. But I also knew this. Her healing was not my responsibility. Her guilt was not my burden. Her choices had shaped me, but they no longer defined me. I had reclaimed my space, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, in every way that mattered. My childhood room was gone. The stranger had long since moved out. The house would be someone else's soon.